Man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. This profound insight from Carl Jung takes on new urgency in our digital age, where the line between authentic selfhood and carefully curated personas has never been more blurred or more psychologically consequential. Have you ever paused to consider how many versions of yourself exist online? The professional self on LinkedIn, carefully highlighting achievements while hiding struggles. The curated happiness of Instagram, where even authentic moments are selected and filtered. The political or intellectual self on Twitter, performing outrage or insight in 280 characters. The nostalgic connection-seeking self on Facebook. The playful or creative self on TikTok or YouTube. What would Jung say about this unprecedented fragmentation of identity? How would he view our digital masks and the psychological impact of maintaining multiple personas across platforms? What happens to the soul, to the authentic self, when so much of our energy is invested in these digital projections? I remember working with a client, let's call her Emma, who came to therapy in a state of profound confusion about her identity. "I don't know who I am anymore," she confessed. "I have 20,000 followers who love a version of me that I've created, but I feel completely empty inside. I spend hours crafting the perfect posts, responding to comments, maintaining this image, but when I put the phone down, I feel like a ghost, like the real me has disappeared." Emma was experiencing what I've come to recognize as a modern psychological crisis, the digital persona overtaking the authentic self. It's a phenomenon Jung couldn't have predicted in its specific technological form, but one his psychological framework helps us understand with remarkable clarity. The persona, Jung's term for the social mask we wear, has always been part of human psychology. But digital technology has amplified its role and impact in ways that pose new challenges for psychological wholeness and authentic living. In the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal what Jung would say about our digital identities, how the unconscious responds when we over-identify with our online personas, and most importantly, how you can reclaim authentic selfhood in a world that constantly pulls you toward fragmentation and performance. By the end of this video, you'll understand that the emptiness or anxiety you might feel in relation to your digital life isn't a personal failing. It's a natural response to unprecedented psychological conditions that require new forms of consciousness and integration. To understand the psychological impact of digital identity, we first need to understand Jung's concept of the persona. Unlike the casual use of the term today to describe personality, Jung had a very specific definition. He described the persona as a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. The word persona comes from Latin, where it originally referred to the masks worn by actors in ancient Greek and Roman theatre. Jung chose this term deliberately to emphasize that the persona is not the whole personality, but a functional aspect, designed for social interaction, a necessary interface between our inner psychological reality and the external social world. In Jung's understanding, the persona serves several important functions. It helps us navigate social situations by providing appropriate roles and behaviors for different contexts. It protects our more vulnerable inner self from unnecessary exposure, and it facilitates smooth social functioning by creating a predictable face we present to others. A healthy persona is flexible and appropriate to context. We naturally present different aspects of ourselves in professional settings versus intimate relationships, for instance. Problems arise not from having a persona, which is both inevitable and necessary, but from over-identifying with it, from confusing the mask with the whole person. Jung warned about this danger, writing, "The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society, fittingly enough a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. When we mistake the persona for the whole self, we create conditions for psychological fragmentation and emptiness. We invest our energy in maintaining an image at the expense of developing authentic selfhood. We become what Jung called identical with the persona, leading to a particular kind of psychological suffering where external success often accompanies Internal emptiness. This dynamic has always existed, but digital technology has transformed the persona in several crucial ways that Jung would find psychologically significant. First, digital technology has multiplied our personas. Where previously we might have maintained a few different social masks for different contexts, professional, family, social, we now potentially maintain dozens across various platforms and accounts. Each platform has its own implicit and explicit rules about appropriate self-presentation, creating pressure to develop platform-specific personas. Second, digital technology has made our personas more permanent and public. Before digital life, our persona performances were generally temporary and context-specific. We showed one face at work, another with friends, another with family. These performances weren't permanently recorded or accessible to all these groups simultaneously. Now our digital personas create permanent records accessible to multiple audiences, collapsing contexts in ways that create new psychological pressures. Third, digital technology has commercialized the persona. Our digital self-presentations aren't just social performances. They're often tied to metrics, likes, shares, followers, that have real-world consequences for status, opportunities, and sometimes income. This creates unprecedented incentives for persona investment and management, turning authentic self-expression into a calculated performance optimized for algorithmic reward. Fourth, digital technology has disembodied the persona. Our digital self-presentations occur without the physical presence that grounds in-person interaction. This separation from embodied experience creates new possibilities for persona construction detached from physical reality, but also removes important feedback mechanisms that help us maintain psychological balance. These transformations of the persona in digital space create what I call the digital amplification, the intensification of persona-related psychological dynamics that have always existed, but now operate with greater intensity and consequence. The curated self versus the authentic self becomes a more extreme contrast when digital tools make perfect curation possible. Photo editing, selective sharing, and the ability to craft and refine our digital presentations create unprecedented gaps between our presented selves and our lived reality. This gap isn't necessarily dishonest. Curation has always been part of social presentation, but its extent and perfection in digital space creates new psychological challenges. A young woman I worked with, let's call her Sophia, maintained an Instagram account showcasing a life of serene minimalism, wellness practices, and aesthetic perfection. Her followers regularly commented on how inspiring her peaceful lifestyle was. The reality? She lived in a cluttered apartment, struggled with anxiety and insomnia, and often felt overwhelmed by life's demands. The contrast between her digital persona and lived reality wasn't a deliberate deception, but a gradual divergence that left her feeling increasingly fraudulent and disconnected from her own experience. This divergence between curated and authentic self creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that comes from holding contradictory beliefs or projecting an image that conflicts with your experience. This dissonance requires psychological energy to maintain, energy that might otherwise go toward authentic development and expression. The psychological impact of likes, shares, and followers represents another dimension of digital amplification. These metrics create external validation systems that can become powerfully linked to self-worth, especially when they're publicly visible and comparable with others. Jung understood that tying self-worth to external validation creates psychological vulnerability. When our sense of value depends on others' responses, we become subject to forces outside our control. The digital quantification of social approval through likes and followers intensifies this dynamic, creating unprecedented feedback loops of validation-seeking behavior. A teenager I worked with, let's call him Jason, described the anxiety of posting on social media. Those first few minutes after posting are excruciating. I keep checking to see who's liked it, and if it doesn't get enough engagement quickly, I'll delete it and try again later. Sometimes I'll delete and repost the same thing 3 or 4 times, trying to find the right time when people will notice it. This hypervigilance around social metrics reflects a psychological merging with the digital persona, where responses to the online self are experienced as direct judgments of personal worth. Digital validation affects brain chemistry in ways similar to other rewards, potentially creating addictive cycles of posting and checking for responses. This neurological reinforcement strengthens identification with the digital persona, making it increasingly difficult to maintain psychological separation between metrics and self-worth. The shadow aspects that emerge in anonymous online spaces represent another crucial dimension of digital psychology that Jung would find particularly significant. The shadow, those aspects of ourselves we've rejected or denied, doesn't simply disappear when repressed. It seeks expression through other channels. Anonymous or pseudonymous online spaces often become outlets for shadow expression, creating a different kind of persona that embodies what we cannot acknowledge in our identified public selves. This explains the psychological phenomenon of ordinarily kind people becoming cruel in anonymous comments sections, or reserved individuals expressing extreme opinions through anonymous accounts. These aren't simply cases of online disinhibition, but expressions of shadow aspects seeking outlets where they won't threaten the primary persona. A man I worked with, let's call him Michael, maintained a professional reputation for calm, reasonableness and conflict avoidance. Yet through an anonymous Twitter account, he engaged in vicious arguments and expressed rage he never acknowledged in his daily life. This split wasn't conscious deception, but psychological compartmentalization, his shadow finding expression where it wouldn't threaten his conscious self-image. Jung would view this compartmentalization as psychologically significant, not as moral failing, but as evidence of disintegration that ultimately demands resolution. When shadow aspects are expressed only through anonymous channels, we miss the opportunity for conscious integration that might lead to greater wholeness and authentic expression. The collective unconscious in the digital age takes on new dimensions that Jung would find fascinating. He proposed that beneath our personal unconscious lies a deeper layer of shared psychological patterns and archetypes common to all humanity. Digital connectivity creates new expressions of this collective dimension, with memes, viral content, and online movements often tapping into archetypal patterns that resonate across cultural boundaries. Jung might view certain internet phenomena as expressions of collective psychological needs or tensions seeking resolution. The rapid spread of particular content often reflects not just clever marketing but resonance with collective psychological patterns, whether shadow aspects finding expression, archetypal figures capturing imagination, or collective emotions seeking acknowledgement. This collective dimension can be both creative and destructive. At its best, it creates new forms of connection and shared meaning-making. At its worst, it amplifies collective shadow aspects, scapegoating, mob behavior, projection of evil onto designated others, without the moderating influence of physical presence and individual responsibility. All these dimensions of digital life affect what Jung called soul, a term he used not in a religious sense, but to describe the animated, vital core of personality that gives life meaning and depth. The soul in Jungian psychology is connected to authenticity, embodied experience, and the integration of conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. Digital life poses specific challenges to soul in this Jungian sense. The disembodied nature of digital interaction removes important dimensions of embodied wisdom and feedback. The performance pressures of digital personas can separate us from authentic expression. The constant external focus on how we're perceived can pull attention away from inner development and reflection. These challenges don't make digital technology inherently anti-soul, but they do require new forms of consciousness to maintain psychological health and authentic development in digital space. Without this consciousness, we risk what Jung might call a loss of soul, not in a dramatic or absolute sense, but as a gradual diminishment of vitality, meaning, and authentic presence. This brings us to the spiritual emptiness that often accompanies digital persona dominance. Many people report a sense of hollowness or disconnection, despite, or sometimes because of, their digital connectivity and successful online personas. This emptiness isn't imaginary or merely philosophical. It reflects a genuine psychological need that remains unmet despite digital achievement or connection. Jung understood that the psyche naturally seeks wholeness and integration, what he called the individuation process. This process requires engagement with both conscious and unconscious aspects of the self, both light and shadow, both social persona and deeper identity. When we invest disproportionate energy in persona maintenance at the expense of this deeper integration, we create conditions for spiritual emptiness regardless of external success or validation. A successful influencer I worked with, let's call her Olivia, described this emptiness vividly. I have everything I thought I wanted, the followers, the sponsorships, the recognition. People tell me daily how much they admire my life. But I feel like I'm performing even when no one's watching. I don't know how to just be anymore. There's this void inside that none of the external validation touches. This void reflects what Jung might call a soul hunger, a need for meaning, authenticity, and integration that persona success alone cannot satisfy. The digital world's emphasis on external metrics and performance can make this hunger particularly acute, creating successful digital personas alongside increasingly empty inner experiences. How can we recognize when the digital persona is overtaking authentic selfhood? There are several signs that Jung would likely identify as psychologically significant. The anxiety of maintaining a digital image is one clear indicator. When you feel persistent worry about how you're perceived online, compulsively check responses to your posts, or experience disproportionate emotional reactions to online feedback, it suggests over-identification with the digital persona. This anxiety reflects the psychological strain of maintaining an image that's become too central to your sense of self. Emotional responses to online validation or rejection provide another important signal. When positive online responses create euphoria and negative or absent responses create despair, it suggests your self-worth has become entangled with digital metrics. This emotional volatility reflects a psychological dependency that compromises authentic selfhood. The blurring of identity boundaries between online and offline self represents another significant indicator. When you find yourself performing digital persona behaviors in offline contexts, posing for photos that won't be posted, mentally composing captions for experiences as they happen, or evaluating real experiences by how they'll appear online, it suggests the digital persona is colonizing authentic experience rather than simply representing it. A young man I worked with, let's call him David, described hiking to a beautiful viewpoint and feeling nothing until he took out his phone to capture it for Instagram. It was like the experience wasn't real until I framed it for sharing, he explained. I couldn't access my own enjoyment directly. It had to be mediated through how others would see it. This mediation of experience through the imagined gaze of the digital audience reflects a significant shift in psychological orientation from direct experience to performance. The exhaustion of constant self-presentation represents perhaps the most common indicator of digital persona dominance. This isn't just physical tiredness, but a particular kind of psychological fatigue that comes from maintaining an image that requires constant attention and management. When being yourself feels like work rather than authentic expression, it suggests the persona has become too rigid or demanding. These signs aren't indications of moral failure or weakness. They're natural psychological responses to unprecedented conditions. The digital environment creates new challenges for maintaining psychological balance between social presentation and authentic selfhood. Challenges that require new forms of consciousness and intentional practice to navigate successfully. So how do we reclaim authentic selfhood in the digital age? Jung would likely emphasize that the goal isn't to eliminate digital personas, which would be neither possible nor desirable in contemporary life, but to develop a more conscious relationship with them, to use them as tools for expression, rather than becoming identified with them. Practical methods for digital boundaries represent an important first step. These boundaries aren't just about time limits, though those can be helpful, but about psychological separation, creating clear distinctions between digital persona management and spaces for authentic being. Try designating specific times for social media engagement rather than allowing it to permeate your entire day. Create device-free zones or times in your home where digital personas are temporarily set aside. Use separate devices or accounts for different purposes if possible, creating physical or virtual boundaries between different aspects of digital engagement. These boundaries help establish psychological distance between you and your digital personas, not to eliminate them, but to prevent over-identification with them. They create space for the question Jung would consider essential: who am I beyond my digital presentations? Reconnecting with the body and emotions provides another crucial pathway to authentic selfhood in the digital age. The disembodied nature of digital interaction can gradually disconnect us from embodied wisdom and emotional authenticity. Intentional practices that bring attention back to physical and emotional experience help counterbalance this disconnection. Regular embodiment practices, whether formal approaches like yoga or dance, or simple attention to bodily sensations throughout the day, help re-establish connection with non-digital aspects of selfhood. Emotional awareness practices, such as journaling about feelings without filtering them for presentation, help maintain contact with authentic emotional experience rather than curated emotional performance. A woman I worked with, let's call her Grace, developed a simple but powerful practice. Before checking social media each day, she would take 3 minutes to scan her body and note her emotional state. After using social media, she would do the same scan, noticing any changes. This simple awareness practice helped her maintain psychological separation between her authentic experience and her responses to digital interaction, preventing unconscious merger between the two. Creating space for the undocumented authentic self is perhaps the most countercultural practice in a world that increasingly equates unshared experience with non-existence. This means intentionally having experiences that you don't document or share, moments that exist solely in direct experience rather than as material for digital presentation. Try having meaningful experiences without taking photos. Practice not sharing significant moments or insights immediately or at all. Notice the difference between experiences you have for their own sake and those you have primarily to share. These practices help strengthen the psychological muscle of direct experience and intrinsic valuation rather than performance and external validation. A teenager I worked with, let's call her Zoe, made a practice of having one meaningful experience each week that she deliberately didn't share online. At first it felt weird, like it didn't fully happen if I didn't post it, she explained. But over time, those became my most special moments, the ones that were just for me, not for my followers. They feel more real somehow, more mine. This sense of experiences being more real, when undocumented, reflects an important psychological truth. Direct experience engages different aspects of the psyche than performed experience. Both have value, but in a culture that increasingly prioritizes performance and sharing, intentional undocumented experience becomes an important practice for maintaining psychological balance. Mindfulness practices for digital consumption help. Develop greater awareness of how digital content affects your psychological state. Rather than consuming content on automatic pilot, practice noticing your bodily and emotional responses to different types of content and interaction. What leaves you feeling energized versus depleted, connected versus isolated, inspired versus inadequate? This awareness helps you make more conscious choices about digital engagement based on its actual effects, rather than habitual patterns. It also strengthens the observing self, the aspect of consciousness that can witness experiences without being completely identified with them, which Jung considered essential for psychological development. Using digital spaces more consciously involves bringing greater intention to how you engage online. Rather than passively drifting through default patterns of consumption and sharing, ask yourself, what is my purpose in this digital space? What am I seeking or offering here? How does this engagement align with my deeper values and authentic self-expression? This consciousness doesn't mean every digital interaction must be deeply meaningful, but it does mean engaging from choice rather than compulsion or unconscious habit. It means using digital tools in service of your whole self, rather than allowing your sense of self to be defined by digital metrics and responses. A writer I worked with, let's call him Thomas, transformed his relationship with Twitter by clarifying his purpose there, to share ideas and connect with other writers. He stopped checking metrics, muted keywords related to outrage and controversy, and limited his time on the platform to specific periods. It went from being a source of anxiety and validation seeking to actually being useful, he explained. I'm using it now instead of it using me. This shift from being used by digital platforms to using them intentionally reflects the kind of conscious relationship with technology that supports rather than undermines authentic selfhood. It represents what Jung might call a more individuated relationship with digital tools, one where they serve the whole self rather than fragmenting it. As you develop greater consciousness of your digital personas and create more space for authentic selfhood, you may notice several shifts in your experience. First, the emotional volatility associated with online validation often decreases. Positive responses remain enjoyable and negative ones remain unpleasant, but neither defines your sense of worth or identity as powerfully. Second, creative energy often increases. The psychological energy previously invested in maintaining and monitoring digital personas becomes available for authentic expression and creation. Many people report feeling more creatively alive when they establish healthier boundaries around digital presentation. Third, relationships often deepen. As you become less identified with digital personas, you create more space for genuine connection, based on authentic presence rather than performance. This doesn't mean sharing everything with everyone. Boundaries remain important, but it does mean engaging from a more integrated and present place. Fourth, a sense of meaning and purpose often emerges or strengthens. Jung observed that meaning comes largely from the integration of conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche, from becoming more whole. As you reclaim energy from excessive persona investment and redirect it toward authentic development, a greater sense of meaning naturally emerges. These shifts don't happen all at once, and the process isn't linear. Digital persona management remains necessary in contemporary life, and finding the right balance is an ongoing practice rather than a destination. The goal isn't perfection, but greater consciousness, using digital tools with awareness rather than being unconsciously used by them. Let's return to Emma, the client I mentioned at the beginning, who felt her authentic self had disappeared behind her digital persona. Through the practices we've discussed, Emma began reclaiming her sense of authentic selfhood alongside her online presence. She established clear boundaries around when and how she engaged with social media, creating device-free times and spaces in her daily life. She developed a regular embodiment practice, bringing attention to physical sensations and emotions without filtering them for presentation. She began having regular experiences that she deliberately didn't document or share, strengthening her capacity for direct enjoyment rather than performed experience. Most importantly, she clarified the relationship between her digital personas and her whole self. My online presence is something I do, not who I am, she explained. It's a creative expression and a way to connect with certain people, but it's not my whole identity. I get to decide what parts of myself to share and what parts to keep private or share only with people I'm close to in real life. This clarity transformed Emma's experience. The anxiety and emptiness she had felt gave way to a greater sense of choice and authentic expression. Her online sharing became more genuine, still curated as all social presentation must be, but flowing from a more integrated place rather than a fragmented one. I actually enjoy creating content again, she told me. When it was my whole identity, it felt exhausting and hollow. Now that it's just one expression of who I am, it feels creative and connecting. The difference is that I'm sharing from fullness rather than trying to fill emptiness through sharing. This transformation illustrates the possibility of authentic expression even in digital spaces. The goal isn't to reject digital life, but to engage with it from a more integrated and conscious place, to use digital tools as expressions of selfhood rather than allowing them to define or fragment the self. As we conclude, I want to offer some final reflections on authenticity in the digital age. Jung believed that authenticity doesn't mean expressing every impulse or sharing every aspect of ourselves indiscriminately. Rather, it means living from an integrated center, a self that includes both conscious and unconscious aspects, both light and shadow, both social presentation and private experience. This integration becomes both more challenging and more necessary in digital space, where fragmentation and performance pressures are built into the environment itself. The platforms we use are designed to capture and monetize attention, often at the expense of psychological wholeness and authentic presence. Navigating them consciously requires ongoing awareness and intention. Yet within these challenges lies opportunity. The very fragmentation of digital life can make us more conscious of psychological dynamics that have always existed but were perhaps easier to ignore in previous eras. The multiple personas we maintain online can help us recognize the multiplicity that exists within the psyche itself, the many aspects of selfhood that Jung called the psychological community. This recognition of multiplicity doesn't mean accepting fragmentation as inevitable. Rather, it invites a more conscious relationship with the different aspects of ourselves, acknowledging their diversity while seeking the deeper integration that Jung saw as the goal of psychological development. In practical terms, this means neither rejecting digital life nor surrendering to its fragmenting tendencies, but engaging with it consciously, using digital tools as expressions of an integrated self, rather than allowing them to define or divide us. It means recognizing that authentic selfhood isn't a fixed state to achieve once and for all, but an ongoing process of becoming more conscious and integrated in how we live and express ourselves across all domains, including digital ones. As Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." This becoming is neither simple nor straightforward in the digital age, but it remains the central task of psychological development. The platforms and technologies change, but the fundamental human need for authentic selfhood and meaningful connection remains constant. In the days and weeks ahead, I invite you to pay attention to your relationship with your digital personas. Notice when you feel anxiety about how you're perceived online. Observe when your mood shifts in response to digital validation or rejection. Be curious about moments when you find yourself performing rather than authentically expressing. And consider experimenting with some of the practices we've discussed: digital boundaries, embodiment, undocumented experiences, mindful consumption, and conscious engagement. These practices aren't about rejecting digital life, but about engaging with it from a more integrated and conscious place. They're about reclaiming the psychological freedom to use digital tools rather than being used by them. And they're about remembering that beneath all the likes, shares, and carefully curated presentations lies something more fundamental and precious: your authentic selfhood, which no digital metric can measure and no algorithm can fully capture. As Jung might remind us if he were observing our digital age, the map is not the territory, the menu is not the meal, and the digital persona, no matter how successful or carefully crafted, is not the whole self. The self includes all of this and more: the documented and undocumented, the shared and private, the conscious and unconscious aspects that together constitute the mystery and miracle of human existence. In a world that increasingly confuses digital metrics with personal worth and online presence with existence itself, perhaps the most radical act is to remember that you are more than your digital presentations, and to live from that deeper, more integrated place of authentic selfhood, using digital tools as expressions of that selfhood rather than substitutes for it.